So in the last video, I shared with you a little bit of how trauma impacts our basic needs. In this lesson, we're going to go deeper into that so that you can really look at what areas were threatened for you specifically. This is going to be a very key part of the process that will allow you later, when we start working on erasing triggers, to understand your behaviors. So many times when we have behaviors that are compulsive or out of control, whether they're interpersonal behaviors or they're behaviors that are, habits that we don't like. So for a really long time, I had a habit of picking at my skin from the time I was, I don't know, probably first time was I saw myself in a picture. I was about 6. And I wasn't able to stop that until I was 30. And I did it myself through this kind of process. What helped me do that most was figuring out how the harming myself was connected to the threats to my basic needs that came from childhood trauma. So you'll see how this works for you as we go through this and in the homework that I'll be telling you about as we work through these slides. So let's go. So I told you already that the bottom of the pyramid is food. So when we are at the food level of the pyramid, there are a couple of things that would impact this. If you have a history of poverty, if there were food rules and compulsivity around food in your home, or if you're in an abusive situation, the only way you can control your situation was to focus on controlling the food you ate or criticizing your body, you're going to have issues here in the food part of the pyramid. Now, usually food issues go hand in hand with relationship issues. So with an absence of sense of belonging, or with difficulty because you're receiving shame, blame, or fear in your relationship while you're growing up with your parent. But food looks like poverty, rules, and control as you're trying to manage yourself because you're in an abusive situation that you can't get out of. So how does that work in poverty? I will say that in my first marriage, my ex-husband's mother lived through World War II. And because of that, she had some habits. They also had extreme poverty when they first immigrated to the United States in the late 50s. Came over on a boat, took 2 weeks to get here. And then were really, really poor while the father found ways to provide for his family before he was established. So by the time I came around, it was 40 years later. However, as an impact of the poverty, his mother did things like she rinsed every piece of tinfoil she ever used to use it again. She rinsed every single plastic bag, reusable Ziploc bag. I don't think they're supposed to be reusable. I think they're meant to be single-use bags, but she rinsed them and used them until they couldn't be used anymore. And she made copious foods for every meal. There was so much food. And if you took regular portions, which is what I did, she criticized you for not eating, not wasting food. So she would create too much food and then criticize anyone who didn't just absolutely feast on the food that she put out. She had food issues based on poverty. So rules like this, if you think about the family that you grew up in, if there were unreasonable rules. I know that in the family I grew up in, you had to be in the clean plate club. So especially when we went to eat at my grandma's house. So anything you put on your plate, you had to eat, which meant that paying attention to your body signals of hunger was secondary to not getting in trouble. Okay, so any issues like this that actually were connected to you using food in a way that isn't focused on how your body responds to food indicates that your food needs weren't met in a way that actually allowed you to feel safe. So that's what I want you to be looking for when you're doing the exercise for this. Now, there's no journaling exercise per se at the end of this slideshow, but if you have the Inner Wisdom Journal, Gratitude and Inner Wisdom Journal that you can buy on Amazon, this would be one of those needs that you would look at in terms of your food need. And there are prompt questions there in that journal. So if you have it, go get it and look at the prompt questions around food. Were you allowed to listen to your body? Did you have enough food? Were you able to respond to your body in the way you wanted? Were you able to? I remember I love beets now, but I used to be forced to eat them and hated them. And so then there was all of this negative feeling and emotion connected with being forced to eat something that my body didn't enjoy. So I want you to kind of take an inventory and look at if you have any issues around food now and struggles with food. I want you to look at how your basic human needs while you were growing up around food got met. Were you allowed to listen to your body? Were you not allowed to listen to your body? And what did that look like for you? Okay. The next one is shelter. So shelter needs get threatened when we live in poverty, right? So in poverty situations, shelter isn't quite adequate to take care of our safety needs that we typically would look for in a home. So when I've been exposed to poverty in the work that I do, it includes having things like bed bugs or having other kinds of bugs in your home, where your food doesn't stay clean, or where the environment comes in. I went into an apartment and was helping to clean an apartment where the shelter wasn't adequate from the outside elements. So there was a lot of mold inside, creating safety issues because it creates health issues. So another way that shelter may be threatened for you is if your family moved a lot. So children get a sense of security by knowing that their surroundings are going to stay the same. Frequent moves create issues around shelter. So that could lead to you feeling like you've never found a home, or you're not comfortable in your home, or you don't like staying in your home. Any kind of issues like that could come from frequent moving. And I'm kind of making some guesses about what it looks like for you. But the truth is, if this is resonating for you, then you will understand, because your body history will tell you, oh, yeah, I did have shelter issues. I felt unsafe. A car crashed into the front of our house once, and that caused shelter issues for me. If you lived in a rough neighborhood where gunshots could come through your house, that's certainly a shelter issue, because your shelter couldn't protect you from things that could come into your home. So that's what shelter looks like. So as you're thinking through this at the end of this video, make sure to identify, did I feel like my shelter was able to adequately protect me from the outside world? That's the question to ask here. Then, physical safety. So, physical safety needs, we know that they're threatened by physical and sexual abuse, by physical illness, and then later we can replay that by overworking. That can also be, in my childhood, it was definitely because I was physically ill and I wasn't allowed to rest as much as I needed, because my needs weren't the most important needs when they were held up against my mother's. So when I needed rest, I was working. When I needed sleep, I was working. Also, fear that kept me awake, and my physical illness kept me awake during the night, so I had lack of sleep. So think about, look over your childhood and go, okay, were there any physical safety issues for me? At this time, it's really not important with this video to go into big details about where the threats were. In fact, I never care about you going into the big details and just like telling a story. I tell you in this program that you don't have to tell a story to heal, and That's the same thing that's true for telling the story to yourself. You don't have to write it out in a journal. You don't have to speak the details. All you need to do, even if we're talking about speaking details privately to yourself, you don't have to do that. All I want you to do is like kind of put a tick mark. Yep, my food needs were threatened. Yep, my shelter needs were threatened. Yep, I had trouble with physical safety. Yeah, it was illness. Yeah, it was physical abuse. Yes, it was sexual abuse. That's all. Just make note, because where this is what will help you later when you've already understood where the problem areas are on this pyramid. Okay, so next slide. Emotional safety. Were you criticized? Were you blamed for things that weren't your fault? Were you disallowed from cleaning up after your own mistakes? Were you called names? And did someone yell at you? All of those things threaten emotional safety. The other thing that I want to say, because sometimes people come to my programs and they say, well, yeah, Tamara, none of this happened to me, but I witnessed it happening to my sibling. So one of the things that we know is that witnessing a sibling being harmed or witnessing a sibling being yelled at, name called, blamed, criticized, can be as traumatizing or more traumatizing to the sibling who isn't receiving the abuse directly. Why? Because children who are siblings in the same sibling group identify with each other. And if someone who you're identifying as more like you is receiving this kind of treatment, then that's going to register as trauma in your brain as well. So recognize that if any of these things were happening in your home, even if you were not the direct recipient, they can register as trauma. If it felt like trauma, if it inspired fear to you, then it's enough to create PTSD symptoms. Okay, so next, sense of belonging. So if you notice when I talk about sense of belonging here, this note on this slide is saying that our sense of belonging is threatened when our emotional safety is threatened. So it's impossible to feel a sense of belonging with someone who's calling you names, who's criticizing you, who's shaming you, who's making you feel guilty for things. That's the opposite of inclusion. So you can pretty much guarantee that if you had a difficulty with your physical safety being threatened in the home you grew up in, that you did not feel a sense of belonging there. So if emotional safety has a tick, you can tick a sense of belonging. The good news is that the bulk of the work that we often do is around establishing a sense of emotional safety and physical safety and secure food and shelter in the now when we're doing this kind of work. And then a sense of belonging can naturally develop. So I want to say a word about domestic violence and abusive adult relationships. I have been in, well, I was 23 when I married my first husband, and he was extremely emotionally abusive. And I stayed with him 14 years. When I left him, I was still in the LDS church, and I had come to believe as a member of that church through my whole lifetime. There were some good experiences there, but some very harmful ones there for me as well. I believed that in order for me to be acceptable to God, I had to be married. And I recognized that that was my error of thinking, but it also was reinforced through the culture and the teachings of the church. So I got married the second time, and I married a guy who looked amazing in public, but privately, he was a mess. He was abusive physically. Later, I found to my children, he was physically abusive to me. He tried to use spiritual coercion. There were so many things that he did that my upbringing kind of prepared me for. It was easy for me to find a sense of belonging with someone who didn't treat me well. This is for my first and second marriages, in a way that was similar to what had happened in childhood. Now, I thought after I left the Mormon church that it wasn't my picker. I thought maybe it was just the church. So then after I left the church, I coupled again. I got married again. And this marriage did connect, and I stayed with him 11 years. But it did connect to my sense of low self-esteem and needing to belong. And he had similar, very negative, very shaming, very rejecting parents as I did. And he was the person who was sexually coercive toward me, who said things to me that made me believe things about myself that weren't true. I wasn't in a solid foundation of who I was. And so coercion, sexual coercion, became part of my life for the 11 years that I was in relationship with him. Why am I telling you this? It's because if you have holes in food, shelter, physical safety, and emotional safety, if you're still trying to get those needs met, but you haven't healed the gaps, then when you get up to the sense of belonging, you're going to find people to belong with who match the deficits that you have in these areas based on your childhood trauma. If you want to get to a place where you experience a sense of belonging and real love in a way that's nurturing and healing, you must first heal the gaps lower in the pyramid. Okay, super, super important. Many times, people who engage in abusive adult relationships, who become victims of domestic violence, have gaps lower down. And many of the programs that are meant to address domestic violence focus on this is what an abuser looks like. In fact, you don't have to go very far on the internet to see this is what a narcissist looks like. There's a problem with that, because knowing what an abuser looks like and knowing what a narcissist looks like doesn't matter if you have a magnet inside where your gap from your childhood trauma matches an abusive person's gap, and then similarity and familiarity will trump you getting your needs met, will trump you feeling a sense of safety in relationship. So that's really important to understand. If you've had a history of relationship abuse as an adult, stop looking for the characteristics of the other person. I did that, and it took me 30 years to get myself out of relationships that were abusive. Some people never do. They never do because they're looking outside to go, okay, is this a nice person or not? Are they lying or not? How am I going to tell? But the minute you start looking to heal what's happening inside and saying, okay, how do I change what's happening inside of me so that it's healthy, then you start attracting healthy and healed instead of still holding gaps that attract people who actually will take advantage of you for those gaps. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions about it, you can ask in the community, and I'll be happy to answer it during one of our live Q&As on Zoom. The next one is love. So here's the other thing I will tell you. Real love is not built on someone taking advantage of your pain, of your gaps that were left behind by childhood trauma. Real love doesn't come from that. That's what we want to look for. We want to heal ourselves first, because love should build you, it should nurture you, it should encourage you. And when you have a real loving relationship, it creates this crucible where healing can happen. So one of the things that I talk about often on my YouTube channel is where your complex PTSD symptoms have calmed down enough that you're dealing with the normal relationship stuff. So my fiance is a delightful guy who he's kind of an advisor. He has this ability to see things and people and then give just like sage advice. And problem is that, there's no prophets in their own land. And so people don't often listen to him. People who have listened have had their life changed. But people don't often, because listening and changing your life in this kind of way takes a lot of work. I tell you that to say that he's sensitive to not being listened to. Now, I had 30 years of damaging relationships after I left my abusive home. So, as a result of that, part of the reason that I survived those 30 years is I got into this habit of looking like I'm listening to my partner and then doing my own thing and sort of shutting them out and taking care of myself. That's how I was able to grow myself until I was able to get out of relationships that were damaging and harmful. It was a survival strategy. It brought me where I am now. But now, at the point of this recording, we've been together for 2 years, and now we had a very insightful conversation the other evening where he was explaining to me his frustration about me not listening. And it was the first time that I really heard and really understood what it was that I had been doing. I had really been saying okay to him and then just doing my own thing. And then I'd come back later and ask him what he said because of course, I wasn't listening and I didn't remember. So in this situation, it's a situation where we're both not getting our needs met. However, because it's a crucible of love and safety, we were able to talk through it. Because it's a crucible of safety and love, I then can say, okay, I don't want you to feel like you're not heard. I'm able to say, I don't want you to feel a lack of safety. I want you to feel loved. I want you to feel heard. I want you to feel seen. And I can pay attention to my habit of not paying attention. That heals him. What does it do for me? It teaches me to trust and be more vulnerable than it was safe for me to be in my relationship from 30 years. And that is what real love does. It changes both of you in positive ways while it nurtures. Anything else that recreates the dynamic that existed while you were a child just creates further harm and reinforces the triggers, the gaps that were already built for you. It reinforces them and makes complex trauma harder to heal. Okay, so again, if you have questions about that, ask in the community and we can talk about it further. This is the arrow added that talks about our parents' job to do it from love and belonging down for us adequately enough so that we can actually attract loving partners. Otherwise, we attract partners who subconsciously recreate the same dynamic with us that we're subconsciously participating in as well. We want to shift that. Then, so what I want you to do, and I've said this before, this is your homework. I want you to identify the areas. You don't have to journal about it. You don't have to get into great detail. I just want you to look at every one of those areas and go, okay, yep, tick mark here, tick mark here. These are areas that were threatened for me. And know, if you decide you want to dig deeper, know that that's the source of out of control trauma habits. That's what we're going to be talking about in the next video. So our next lesson is how we use unhealthy behaviors to meet our unmet needs. Most of the time it doesn't work, but we keep trying. So I'll see you in the next video.